The town of Taro's End sat at the edge of the world, or so it felt to those who lived there. Clinging to a crescent of rugged coast, the town was cradled by wind-swept cliffs on one side and the ever-churning sea on the other. Salt hung thick in the air, carried by the ceaseless breeze that whistled through shuttered windows and rusted chains. Time passed slowly in Taro's End, measured not by clocks, but by the tides and gull cries. Only a handful of residents lived there year-round: fishermen, lighthouse keepers, and the quietly curious. The town had long since faded from maps, forgotten by tourists and shipping routes alike. But its shoreline told stories: shattered masts jutting from the sands, barnacle-covered hulls half-buried in seagrass, and rusted anchors that hadn't budged in decades. Every wreck came with a legend, and every legend had one thing in common: the cat. They called her Storm. No one knew where she came from. She simply appeared one morning years ago, standing atop a weathered piling on the docks, tail flicking as if keeping time with the waves. A calico with striking eyes, one green, one gold, Storm moved with a kind of purpose that unsettled even the most hardened sailors. She prowled the shorelines and docks as though she owned them, vanishing for days and reappearing with seaweed clinging to her fur, or a piece of driftwood clamped gently between her teeth. The townsfolk spoke of her in hushed tones, with a reverence reserved for saints and sea spirits. Some swore she was the reincarnation of an old sailor lost at sea, cursed or blessed, to return as the town's eternal watchman. Others claimed she was older than the town itself, a guardian tied to the ancient rhythms of the sea. But what everyone agreed on was this: Storm could sense things. She always knew when the weather would turn. Long before the skies darkened or the surf rose, Storm's behavior would shift. She'd become restless, pacing the docks with low growls rumbling in her throat. She'd disappear from her usual spots: Old Man Keller's boathouse, the lighthouse steps, the pier's end, and take up a silent vigil on the cliffside, staring out to sea with her tail twitching like a metronome of dread. And so, when the air grew heavy one late autumn afternoon, the townspeople took notice. The ocean was calm, but wrong. It moved with a slowness that felt forced, like it was holding its breath. Gulls flew inland in scattered flocks, screeching more than usual, and the fishermen tugged their boats higher on the shore, just in case. Storm was nowhere to be seen that morning, not lounging on the fish crates behind the bait shop, not curled in the crook of the harbormaster's chair. It wasn't until dusk that she appeared, emerging from the fog that rolled in thick and low. She walked with deliberate steps, her fur fluffed against the wind, eyes locked on the horizon. A few of the townsfolk gathered at the edge of the docks to watch her. No one spoke, they just followed her gaze. Out there, beyond the jagged rocks and roiling swells, the sky had begun to bruise. Hints of violet and ink-black clouds twisted on the edge of visibility, rippling across the water like ink spilled in a bowl. The air turned colder. A gust of wind howled between the buildings, slamming a shutter closed with a bang that echoed like cannon fire. Storm didn't flinch. She moved to the end of the pier, sat back on her haunches, and lifted her head. Her ears twitched, her whiskers trembled. Her eyes, those mismatched eyes, narrowed as if she were watching something no one else could see. A boy named Tobias, barely 12, whispered to his grandfather beside him, "She knows something." The old man didn't answer. He only tightened his grip on the boy's shoulder. The first droplets of rain began to fall, soft, tentative, like the sea was testing its own strength. Storm remained, a solitary figure against the growing gale. Her body was still, but her tail lashed the wooden planks behind her like a warning. The townspeople slowly dispersed, called home by instincts older than memory. Doors were bolted, lanterns lit, but even after the last light in the town flickered out, Storm remained at the edge of the world, staring out into the darkness, waiting. She knew what the sea was about to bring. Elliot Graves had fished the waters off Taro's End for over 30 years. He knew the tides like the wrinkles in his weathered hands and could read the clouds better than the weekly forecast. But on this particular morning, he ignored the feeling that tugged at the base of his spine, the same feeling that had saved him more than once. His wife, Maggie, stood at the window of their cottage, arms crossed, brow furrowed. "Elliot, look at the sky," she said as he pulled on his oilskin coat. "You know better than this." "It's just a squall," Elliot replied, brushing a kiss against her cheek. "I'll be back before lunch." Maggie didn't smile. Her eyes lingered on the darkening horizon. Storm's acting strange again. Elliot paused for a second. He knew what that meant. Everyone in town did. But stubbornness ran deep in him, deeper than caution. "The sea's not the boss of me," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He pushed off from the dock in his small boat, the Mags, the name painted carefully on the hull by Maggie's own hand years ago. The water lapped gently at first, the wind teasing rather than howling. But the calm was deceptive, and Elliot knew it. By the time he reached the outer edge of the bay, the wind had sharpened. The waves rose taller. The horizon vanished into a wall of mist and roiling sky. He turned the boat, ready to head back. That's when the sea struck. The first wave hit with the force of a moving truck. The Mags pitched hard to starboard, and Elliot gripped the wheel until his knuckles blanched. Rain lashed his face like needles. His radio crackled with static, then went silent. The compass spun wildly, directionless. "Come on, girl, hold together," he whispered to the boat, voice barely audible above the wind's roar. From the shoreline, the townspeople had already taken shelter, windows shuttered and lanterns blown out. But one figure remained, a lone calico cat crouched at the end of the pier. Storm. She sat motionless, tail curled around her paws, eyes fixed on the frothing sea. Her fur was soaked, but she didn't move. Something ancient shimmered in her stillness, something more than feline, a knowing. She wasn't just watching the storm, she was waiting for it. Back at sea, Elliot's arms burned from trying to control the boat. His soaked coat clung to him like a second skin, heavy and cold. Another wave slammed into the side of the Mags, sending him sprawling across the deck. He scrambled back to the wheel only to realize they were spinning, disoriented, adrift. No, not like this," he growled, coughing against the salt in his throat. For the first time in years, Elliot felt fear in his bones. Lightning cracked above him, illuminating a churning wall of water ahead, twice as tall as any he'd seen. There was no outrunning it, no steering through it. The boat rose, then tipped sharply forward. Elliot held on, closing his eyes. And then, just as quickly, the water calmed. Not fully, but enough for him to breathe again. The boat bobbed roughly, but it floated. He blinked through the rain, dazed, unsure if the wave had passed or if it had only spared him. In the distance, barely visible through the sheets of rain, was a small shape, a flicker of color on the water. First, he thought it was debris, but then it moved, a calico pattern, unmistakable. Storm. How she got there, Elliot didn't know. But she was standing, yes, standing, on a stretch of driftwood that rode the water like a raft, her eyes fixed on him with unblinking intensity. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. The sea was raging, yes, but something deeper was at work here, something he couldn't explain. Storm blinked slowly, once, and then she turned, as if beckoning him to follow. A gust of wind slammed into him again, and just like that, she was gone, lost in the waves. But something in Elliot shifted. The panic drained. His hands steadied on the wheel. He turned the boat toward where she disappeared, trusting, without understanding why, that it was the right direction. Back on shore, Storm padded back onto the pier, soaked but unharmed. She shook the water from her fur, then glanced once more at the horizon. The worst was yet to come, but the sea had not taken Elliot. Not yet. The storm didn't calm, it escalated. The sky turned a deeper gray, almost black, as thunder cracked like splitting stone. The sea churned with relentless fury, and waves slammed against the cliffs with the rage of ancient gods. In the midst of it all, Storm darted through the drenched alleyways of Taro's End like a streak of living lightning. Maggie Graves stood by the window, heart in her throat. She had been watching the sea for hours, praying for a glimpse of the mags. But the water was all whitecaps and chaos. No boat in its right mind would still be out there. Then she saw her. Storm. The cat appeared at the edge of the garden, soaked to the bone, her calico fur clinging to her frame. Her golden eyes met Maggie's through the rain-splattered glass, and for a split second, everything else disappeared. The wind, the fear, the fury of the sea. It all vanished under the weight of that stare. Then Storm turned and bolted toward the cliffs. Maggie didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat, pulled on her boots, and raced after the cat, not bothering to explain to anyone. Not that anyone would be outside in this weather to listen. Her gut told her that Storm knew something. Somehow, impossibly, this strange little creature was guiding her. The rain pelted her face, sharp as needles. Mud clung to her boots. The wind howled like it had teeth. But Storm never slowed. She slipped between rocks and puddles with uncanny grace, her tail raised like a banner in the mist. Maggie followed as best she could, her breath coming in ragged bursts. The cliffs loomed ahead, jagged silhouettes against the crashing waves below. Storm veered sharply, taking a narrow footpath that Maggie had never noticed before. Hidden behind a tangle of seagrass and twisted roots, the path was no wider than a sheep trail. On any other day, it would be invisible. But now, as if unveiled by the storm itself, it glowed faintly with a sheen of rain and sea spray. Storm looked back, just once, as if to make sure Maggie was still there. "I'm coming," Maggie panted. "Just don't lose me." The path hugged the cliffside tightly. One misstep could mean a fall into the foaming surf below. But Maggie pressed on, clinging to rocks and using her hands for balance as the trail wove around outcrops and narrow ledges. Storm remained just ahead, her movements sure and unwavering. Then, almost as suddenly as it had appeared, the trail opened up. Maggie found herself standing on a wide ledge, shielded by a natural overhang of stone. Below, the cliffs curved inward, forming a hidden inlet, a hollow in the rock face that could only be seen from this exact vantage point. And nestled in the corner of that inlet was a cave. It wasn't large, but it was dry and tucked away, invisible from the sea or the town. Maggie's breath caught as she stared down at it. It looked like a place someone could wait out a storm, a place someone like Elliot might find refuge. But it wasn't just the cave that held her attention. Far below, just past the mouth of the inlet, a boat struggled against the wrath of the waves. A searchlight cut through the mist in a frantic sweep. The Coast Guard, a rescue boat, fighting to stay upright, it inched closer to the rocky shoreline. Maggie's heart surged. "They're looking for him," she whispered, tears mingling with the rain on her face. Storm stood beside her, calm despite the wind. She stared out at the rescue vessel, then slowly sat down, tail curled neatly around her paws. She had brought Maggie here for a reason. "I don't know how," Maggie murmured, kneeling beside the cat. "But you knew. You knew he was out there." Storm blinked once, slowly. Below, the boat's horn cut through the wind, a long, low sound of hope. Maggie rose to her feet, filled with a new determination. If the rescuers were close, if they were this near to where Elliot could be, then there was still time. She had to help them, had to show them the way. And now she could. Storm turned and padded back toward the path, and Maggie followed her, heart pounding. The sea was still angry, the sky still raged, but Maggie wasn't afraid anymore, because somewhere out there Elliot was fighting, and Storm had shown her the way. The cave was colder than Maggie expected. Water dripped from the ceiling in slow, rhythmic taps, echoing faintly in the stillness. Outside, the storm roared with full fury, waves pounding the cliffs like war drums, the wind shrieking as it tore through the rocks. But within the stone hollow, there was a strange calm. The air was damp but still, and the only sound aside from the storm was the soft rustle of Storm's paws on the rocky floor. Maggie wrapped her coat tighter around herself as she stepped further inside. She expected the cave to be shallow, but it reached deeper than she imagined, winding slightly before opening into a wider chamber. Storm sat already in the center, her golden eyes alert and watchful. Then Maggie saw it. In the shadows along the wall, barely illuminated by the occasional flash of lightning, were the remnants of something old: wooden beams, rusted bolts, frayed rope, and shattered pieces of what once might have been a hull. A broken lantern hung crookedly from a metal hook. She took a cautious step forward, crouching to inspect one of the beams. It was warped and sea-stained, but she could just make out the trace of something carved into it. Letters, faint and smoothed by time, but they're nonetheless. Sea Wraith. Maggie's breath caught. The Sea Wraith. That name hadn't been spoken in decades, not seriously. It was one of the old tales, told to children at bedtime or shared in hushed tones during storms like this. The Sea Wraith had been a merchant vessel, caught in a sudden storm just off the coast over a century ago. According to the stories, the ship had vanished without a trace. No wreckage had ever been found, no survivors, just rumors and legends. And at the heart of those legends was the Stormbringer cat. Maggie's heart thudded in her chest as she sat on a nearby rock, her mind drifting to the stories her grandmother used to tell. A cat always appearing before great storms, warning those wise enough to listen. Some said the cat was a spirit of the sea. Others believed it was a guardian, tasked with protecting the town from its own pride and recklessness. There had always been a calico cat in Taro's End. Not always the same one, but always watching, always silent. Maggie had seen Storm growing up, just as her parents had, and her grandparents before them. Always on the docks, always near the cliffs when the sky darkened. And now here she was again. Storm blinked slowly and turned her head toward the entrance of the cave. Maggie followed her gaze, seeing only the sheets of rain and the gray blur of the sea. Somewhere out there, Elliot was still fighting for his life. Elliot gritted his teeth as another wave smashed against the bow of his boat. He could barely see the controls now, his hands slipping on the wheel, the engine coughing as salt water poured over the stern. He had never seen the sea like this. It wasn't just angry, it was alive and furious. He tried to steer east, toward the lighthouse, but the wind kept pushing him back. Every move felt like a gamble. The GPS was dead, the radio a useless crackle. The only thing he had left was his instinct, and the fading image of Maggie, standing on the shore, pleading with him not to go. "I'm coming back," he whispered through gritted teeth. "I have to." But even as he said it, his strength was failing. The wheel slipped from his grip again. A monstrous wave surged beneath the hull and hurled the boat to one side. Elliot slammed into the railing, pain shooting through his shoulder. The world tilted, and for a moment, he was certain the sea would swallow him whole. Back in the cave, Maggie knelt beside Storm. "Do you know where he is?" she whispered, voice trembling. "Can you get us to him?" Storm looked up at her, and for the first time, Maggie could have sworn there was more than just feline awareness behind those eyes. There was something ancient, something knowing. The wind howled louder, and Maggie stepped to the cave's edge. The sea was still wild, but the lightning had started to move offshore. In the far distance, just beyond the haze, the searchlight of the rescue boat blinked again, closer this time. Hope flickered. Storm stood and walked toward the path leading out of the cave. Maggie followed, heart pounding. The storm was at its peak, but change was coming, and the cat was on the move. The wind screamed like a wounded animal as Maggie stumbled down the rocky path, shielding her eyes from the rain that lashed sideways across the cliffs. Her fingers clutched the wet stone for balance while Storm moved ahead with uncanny certainty, each step deliberate, as if she'd walked this path 100 times before. Lightning cracked the sky, splitting it into jagged pieces. Below, the ocean heaved in fury. Waves rose like walls, crashing down on the jagged rocks with relentless force. Amid the chaos, Maggie's eyes caught a flicker of movement offshore. A boat, its searchlight slicing through the rain. "They're coming," she breathed. "Thank God, they're coming." But her relief was short-lived. The rescue vessel rocked violently, its silhouette pitching and swaying in the merciless swell. Even from the cliffs, Maggie could tell the crew was struggling to hold course. They were headed too close to the eastern ridge, a treacherous patch where the water ran deceptively shallow and the rocks jutted like broken teeth. Storm stopped suddenly and turned, her tail flicking with urgency. She darted off the path and down toward a weathered outcrop that overlooked the harbor. Maggie hesitated for only a second before following. When she reached the overlook, she could see everything. The rescue boat, Elliot's barely floating skiff, and the dangerous waters between them. Storm stood tall, facing the storm with unwavering stillness. Her eyes locked with Maggie's, and it was as if the howling wind fell silent for just a moment. Maggie understood. She fumbled for the flare gun hanging at the harbor's emergency post. Old, but still loaded. She aimed it toward the safer channel, just north of the boat's current path. With shaking hands, she fired. The red flare shot into the sky, arcing high before bursting into light over the safer waters. On the deck of the rescue boat, the crew saw it. "There!" one of them shouted. "Signal, change course now." The captain didn't question it. He spun the wheel hard to starboard, trusting the sudden light in the sky. The boat veered away from the ridge just as a massive wave crashed where they'd been seconds earlier. They spotted Elliot's vessel seconds later, battered, half-flooded, and perilously close to the rocks. "There's a man on board. Hold position. Get the hook." Elliot, clinging to what remained of his wheel, barely registered the rescue boat approaching. He saw the bright spotlight cut through the haze, heard shouting over the roar of the sea, and then, strong hands gripping his arms, pulling him over the railing of salvation. His vision blurred as the world tilted sideways. Cold rain, shouts, the creaking of metal, and then nothing but the steady thrum of the rescue vessel's engine pulling away from the rocks. Maggie watched it all unfold from the cliff's edge, heart pounding with equal parts fear and hope. When she saw Elliot, soaked, slumped, but alive, pulled aboard the boat, her knees buckled. She didn't cry, not yet. She just pressed her hand to her chest and whispered, "Thank you." Storm stood beside her, calm and unmoved by the crashing waves below. Her fur, soaked and heavy with rain, clung to her body, but her eyes never left the sea. She watched until the rescue boat turned toward the harbor, its light steady now, its course sure. Only then did the wind begin to soften. The rain grew gentler, as if the storm had spent its final breath. The clouds began to break apart, and a pale light, moonlight perhaps, broke through in streaks across the waves. Maggie made her way back down to the harbor where the rescue crew helped Elliot onto the dock. He was weak, trembling, but breathing. She ran to him and wrapped her arms around his soaked frame, holding on as if afraid the sea might take him again. "I told you not to go," she whispered into his shoulder. "I know," Elliot rasped. "I should have listened." They didn't need more words. When they finally turned toward the cliffs, they saw her. Storm stood at the highest point above the harbor, her silhouette framed by the storm-cleared sky. She sat still and silent, tail curled neatly around her feet, watching them with the same calm eyes as always. Eyes that had seen more than they could ever know. And in that moment, Maggie didn't see just a cat. She saw a guardian. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in every gust of wind and ripple across the water. Morning brought a pale, hazy light, soft and unsure, as if the sky itself was still recovering from the night's fury. Seagulls circled low over the harbor, cautiously returning to the air. The docks were scattered with debris. Broken crates, coiled nets, pieces of wood that no longer belonged to any boat. People emerged from their homes slowly, blinking at the damage, clutching coats and blankets around their shoulders. But they were safe. Word spread quickly of what had happened, of the rescue, of Elliot's return, of the cat. Maggie stood near the shoreline, hand wrapped gently around Elliot's as he sat on a bench, legs stiff and sore but alive. Fishermen, shopkeepers, and children gathered around them. They listened quietly as Maggie recounted how Storm had led her along the cliffs, down forgotten paths, and to the very spot where she could signal the rescue team in time. "She knew," Maggie said softly, her voice carrying over the hushed group. "She knew exactly where to go, as if she could see through the storm." The townspeople looked at one another, murmuring. Old Marla, the baker who had lived in the town her entire life, nodded knowingly. "I told you," she whispered. "She's not just a cat. She's always been watching." Later that day, Maggie walked alone down the beach, her boots sinking slightly into the wet sand. The tide had pulled back further than usual, exposing bits of driftwood and smooth stones glistening under the gray sky. She paused near the wreckage of a small rowboat that had washed ashore, likely from the storm. The sight of the broken frame reminded her of all the wrecks she'd seen over the years. Skeletons of ships buried in sand, their names worn away by salt and time, and always somehow Storm had been nearby. She remembered hearing the stories as a child. Tales of a guardian spirit sent by the sea, a creature that appeared when danger loomed and vanished just as silently. The Stormbringer, they'd called it. Back then, she had rolled her eyes at such myths. Now she wasn't so sure. Could it be that the legends weren't just stories? That storm wasn't just unusually clever, but something older, something that had always been part of the coast? As if summoned by her thoughts, a soft paw print appeared beside her own in the sand. She turned. There was Storm, sitting a few feet away, tail curled neatly around her legs. Her coat, still damp in places, glistened in the light. She blinked slowly at Maggie, not meowing, not moving, just watching, as she always had. "I don't know what you are," Maggie said gently, kneeling in the sand. "But thank you." Storm tilted her head, as if accepting the words, and then stood. She turned and began to walk toward the mist drifting in from the sea. Back in town, someone had placed a small bowl of milk and a blanket at the harbor steps. A hand-painted sign leaned beside it, "For our guardian." People came and went, leaving offerings, shells, fish, even a small wooden carving of a cat. Children drew pictures of Storm saving the town. Some whispered thanks, others spoke openly of the legend reborn. It didn't matter if they believed the stories before. They believed now. Elliot watched it all from his window, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Looks like she's part of the town's story now," he said. "She always was," Maggie replied. And then, just as quietly as she had come, Storm disappeared. No one saw her leave. One moment, she was perched near the docks, and the next, gone. Vanished into the morning mist curling over the shoreline. Some said she returned to the sea, walking its edge like a keeper of tides. Others believed she would return when she was needed again. But Maggie didn't need to see Storm to know she was still there, somewhere watching. The town would rebuild. The boats would be repaired, the nets rewoven. Life would return to normal or something close to it. But they would never forget, because legends weren't always made of ghosts or gods. Sometimes they had fur, silent paws, and eyes that held the weight of the sea. The days that followed were calm, the kind of quiet only a storm can leave behind, heavy with reflection, but touched by gratitude. The townsfolk repaired what could be fixed, mourned what was lost, and celebrated what had been saved. Boats were righted, sails restitched, and the docks buzzed with life again. But Storm was gone. Maggie and Elliot took long walks along the beach each morning, searching for a glimpse of the calico cat. They checked the harbor steps, the worn rocks near the cliffs, even the hidden paths Storm had once led them through. But there were no paw prints in the sand, no flick of a tail in the distance, no sign at all. "She's really gone," Elliot said softly one morning as they watched the tide roll in. Maggie nodded, staring at the sea. Maybe she was never meant to stay. They stood there for a long time, letting the salt wind brush against their cheeks. Behind them, the town carried on. But in their hearts, a quiet ache lingered. A farewell not spoken, a presence deeply missed. As weeks passed, the story of Storm took on a life of its own. Children began painting her image on driftwood, with brushstrokes that mimicked the calico pattern. One artist in town even sculpted a weathered statue of her, placing it near the lighthouse where she had once perched. Visitors who had never seen the cat came to hear the story, their curiosity drawn in by the whispers of a feline guardian. The legend grew. People said the sea had sent Storm to protect the town. Some claimed she was the spirit of an old sailor, reborn with whiskers and wisdom. Others believed she was a gift from the ocean itself, a living piece of the tide, watching, waiting. Storm became more than just a memory. She became a symbol. Parents told their children the tale on stormy nights, curled by firesides while the rain tapped against the windows. The Stormbringer, they'd say, a cat who walked through thunder and fog to save the ones she loved. The legend was no longer just Maggie and Elliot's. It belonged to everyone now. Maggie often found herself back by the cave where she and Storm had taken shelter. She'd sit on a rock with a thermos of tea, listening to the waves echo through the stone walls. Sometimes she imagined she could still hear soft paw steps behind her, or feel the brush of fur against her leg. But when she turned, there was nothing, only the wind. Still, it brought her peace. One day, as she walked the beach alone, Maggie knelt to pick up a piece of driftwood. On it, the sea had etched a shape that almost looked like a cat curled up in sleep. She smiled and slipped it into her coat pocket. "Thank you," she whispered. She wasn't sure who she was thanking, the sea, the sky, or the cat that had changed everything. Elliot returned to fishing, but never without checking the skies first. He trusted the ocean, but he respected it more now. On calm days, he swore he could hear a faint meow in the distance, just under the sound of the surf. "She's still out there," he'd tell Maggie with a wink. "Just making sure I'm not being foolish." Maggie would smile and nod. "She always did keep a close eye on you." Seasons passed. The storm became a chapter in the town's history, retold with awe and affection. And though Storm never returned, her spirit remained. In the hush of approaching fog, in the crash of distant waves, in the watchful eyes of every stray cat that wandered through town, just for a while, before disappearing into the mist. The townspeople never forgot, and they never stopped believing. One evening, the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting gold across the waves. Maggie and Elliot stood hand in hand at the edge of the shore, the tide gently lapping at their feet. "It's quiet," Maggie said. "Peaceful," Elliot agreed. They listened for a while, no thunder, no wind, just the soft rhythm of the sea, like a lullaby. As they turned to leave, Maggie glanced back one last time. The sand behind them was smooth, untouched, no paw prints, but in her heart, she felt them there. Storm hadn't left. She had become part of the ocean, part of the legend, part of them all. And as the waves whispered their eternal hush against the shore, the town remained at peace, forever guarded by the memory of a cat who had once walked through a storm and saved them all.